How come it's so dark? All the lights on. For the first time after 135 interviews, I'm not going to invigilate because today they're talking about something about which I know so little, so I don't want to intrude. It is a very esoteric subject. So if you're bored, it can only mean one thing, that you are intellectually inferior. If you're intelligent, you will find it fascinating, because we were just talking about the extraordinary thing about Confucius was that he codified how we behave, not necessarily for the aristocracy, but for everybody, as a sense of discipline in the vernacular society. And that was 551 BC, which is essentially 2,500 years. We don't know what the Indians did. They probably did something similar when Buddha was around, who was contemporaneous. And then I can only think of the Catholic Church, and about 500 years later, where they codified the Mass, I suppose, as a ritual, but not so much about how people should use their body to express themselves, but as a memorial to what Jesus Christ did. And then I suppose Muhammad came along in 630, whatever it is, and, sorry, 1 minute. My dog is asking me. I'll call you back, dogs. And he started, of course, another huge ritual. But the astonishing thing to me is that in the case of Confucius, everything which is now happening is very similar to what he wrote down and codified. And today we've got two experts who are going to tell us exactly what he did. And I find it very fascinating, and it is extraordinary how we look at the pomp and circumstance of Britain and admire it, and you are just juveniles. You know, cover 100 years, 600 years, 800 years. Dave Carr thinks that, you know, that's bee's knees, and it is nothing. We trample on the ceremonial code literally by thousands of years. Without further ado, I got to go and make a phone call to Confucius' ancestors, and I'm going to leave the two experts to show you what they're going to talk about, and I will be returning here to give them support and listen to your questions, which have got to be either intelligent or intellectual. Otherwise, you're not worthy to be here, even if you paid, and I want a double payment. Over to you.
Thank you, Sir David. And I have to say that it's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here. I haven't been in this building since it first opened, which I'm told is 2.5 years ago. We are today going to be talking about Confucianism, and I have to say that a great deal of scholarly effort has been going on for a very long time trying to figure out what Confucianism is. And there are many views. Is it a philosophy? Is it a religion? What on earth really is it? And the answer is it's very, very difficult to pigeonhole one way or another. It's hard to categorize. So what we're going to try to do today is to show you the non-philosophical side of Confucianism. And my contention is that that side of Confucianism is what makes it exist. It could not have perpetuated for so long without the culture of Confucianism as opposed to the ideas. So to start off with, the title, The Body of Confucius, what does this mean? Let's see if all this works. This, I'm going to show you very quickly a sequence of passages from what we call in Chinese the Lunyu, the Analects of Confucius. This is a collection of quotes and conversations, sayings from Confucius and his disciples, now generally regarded as the most immediate source we have for understanding Confucius himself, although the Analects text was still being added to until about 100 years after he died. So it's sort of an accretion of oral lore about Confucius and his disciples that took shape and was gradually written down and reached its final form, we think, about a century after his death. Now, I said it's sayings and conversations. In fact, there is one chapter of the Analects, it's called something along the lines of In the Village, or Xiangdang, which is not sayings and conversations, but is descriptive. Examples of Confucius's deportment and behavior. There isn't time to go through all of these, but you can see the gist. I hope if you're not, it's a bit small, I'm sorry, but the bits in red are showing what Confucius does with his body, his behavior, his face, his demeanor. So he would display respectful uneasiness, for example. The way he inclined his body, holding his arms out, this is like wings. Those of you who can read the Chinese, that's up there as well. There are a lot here, even I can't quite see it, but
Can you bring them on as a...
yeah, that one already has been, but this one...
Where are the figures? Where are the figures?
Mention of him not daring to breathe. But the point is that it's describing his behavior as being extremely precise and correct in every conceivable situation. If he's with the ruler, his lord, or a lord, there's a certain, his knees bend, he walks in a particular way, a more hurried way, he displays a ritual uneasiness. All of this has to do with ritual, and it's the way he expresses himself through the body. So this entire chapter is just about his body. So when he was carrying the scepter of the ruler, he acted as if it was very heavy. If the mat wasn't correctly placed, he wouldn't sit on it. Presumably he would adjust it first or get someone else to do it. The other one is a sort of exorcistic ceremony, and he stood on the steps. And this is a sort of formal expression for the steps on the east to watch in his full court regalia. And this was his correct way of responding to the performance of this ritual. We're not exactly sure what it means to lie like a corpse, but even when he slept, he would not lie in a way that was imprecise or bad. This is what he would do when he was going to get into what here is translated as a carriage. We usually translate it as chariot because of the way it's designed. Standing very straight again. Here I'm adding one more bit because this is part of the rest of the Analects, which is speeches and sayings, and this is something he mentions relating to archery, where the point is not to hit the target because people are of different strength, or to pierce the target. The point really is elsewhere, as we'll describe a bit later. Now here we have two things. The first one is from the In the Village chapter, and it says that when he entered the ancestral temple of the state rulers, he would ask about everything. So why did he do that? This practice of his is actually mentioned elsewhere in the places where they have conversations, and someone who is skeptical. Why is he asking about all this? That means he doesn't know anything about ritual. And he said the master heard the remark, and his response was, it is the rule of ritual propriety for me to do that. So that was an observance of ritual. He explains it. And so in a way, the entire chapter of In the Village does not actually use the word ritual, which I'll talk about in a minute at all. But in this other passage, it explicitly links this behavior to his ritual. So the key word here is this Chinese word li, which we often translate as ritual. It can also be translated as propriety of behavior, manners, civility. It's identified as being one of the 5 cardinal Confucian virtues. So it isn't just codes of behavior, it is a correct moral good in itself. So I would contend, and Confucius himself really said, to understand what Confucianism is, one must understand Li, this concept of Li. We are, especially nowadays, accustomed to thinking of Confucianism as a philosophy. And of course, there is much sophisticated philosophy in the Confucian tradition from ancient times right down to the present day. But the ideas alone cannot explain what Confucianism is, or explain its remarkable hold on Chinese culture for more than well over 2,000 years. It is important to remember that Confucianism has also always been a living culture. It's through daily living, daily life, and especially the practice of Li, that the Confucian moral virtues are acquired and expressed. So it is as much about what people do as it is about what they think. And Confucius himself placed Li at the heart of Confucian practice, or of the practice of what he taught, which of course wasn't called Confucianism, that's a Western word. This is something that is very difficult for the Western mind to grasp. The sheer wealth of details in Confucian ritual does make very little sense to a Western mind. There are instructions on clothing, hats, chariots, decorations, protocol in meetings between people of the same or different status, funerals, sacrificial observances. A lot of this sort of thing appears in the Analects and other Confucian texts with a great deal of, there's an awful lot of it. I remember 10, 15 years ago, The Economist rather sort of flippantly mentioned Confucianism in China as being very hard to approach. It's all full of horses and chariots and all sorts of weird things, makes no sense at all. And my counterpart in Cambridge, a man named Mark Lewis, who's since gone to America, wrote a furious letter to The Economist saying, this is something taken very seriously and it means a great deal, and pretending that it's just silly means you're not even trying to making any kind of an attempt to understand it. I also have here John Steele, who's the translator, the British translator of the Ely, Book of Etiquette and Ceremonial. And he said in his introduction, I've got there, the amount of repetition and unnecessary detail will make the reading of parts of the book almost as wearisome a task as was the translation of it. Although then he goes on to say, but actually it's pretty important stuff. We need to understand why it's there and how it works. So it is clear from the Analects that Li was very important to Confucius. Why was this? An important thing to remember here is that what we now know of as Confucian ritual is in large part pre-Confucius. Much of it existed centuries before Confucius himself. And to understand this, we need to understand the historical background of the time when Confucius lived. This was late in his birth and death dates, as best we know, are there, 551 to 479 BCE. This was late in what we call the Spring and Autumn period, or the Eastern Zhou dynasty, and most of the Eastern Zhou dynasty. So that's 722 to 468 BC. So the Chinese world of the Spring and Autumn period was completely different from what it later became. It was ruled by an aristocracy, a hereditary aristocracy, which prided itself in its accomplishment of refined arts, including ritual, which they call wen in Chinese, but also martial arts, including archery. They went to war a lot. Warfare and battles was an essential part of their lives, conducted according to a strict code of etiquette, highly ritualized warfare, which was really a form of service to the ancestors of the individual state. At the time of Confucius, there were 72 states ruled by hereditary feudal lords. We translate them as dukes, marquises, earls, barons, things like that, viscounts, which is a bit dangerous in a way because it brings to mind, certainly to my mind, all sorts of the regalia of European feudal lords. But
is exactly the reflection.
yes.
Duke, Marquis, Earl, Viscount, and Baron. 公侯伯子男.
Yes.
It's
Gong.
exactly the same.
Translated-
It's extraordinary.
Yeah, it's a gong ho. That's a gong ho bo zi nan. Yeah, in Mandarin.
Except that baroness is called a male baron. 公侯伯子男.
So these were hereditary. They ruled their domains under a king. Their overlord was a king who was quite weak in the Eastern Zhou, the king of the Zhou. So they were essentially autonomous. And Confucius was a master. He was a teacher who taught the aristocratic learning of the time. He knew it very well in all its phases. And the important branches of the learning, four are worth particular mention. There were others, but these are worth particular mention. One was the songs, the odes, which we now know as the canon or classic of songs or odes. This is a text that was fixed even by his time. The one that we have now, the transmitted version, is the same. Sometimes different characters were used, but it's clear they were used to write the same sound. So this was a really fixed text. People would have learnt it by heart. They used the different odes for diplomatic communications between the states. The second is the documents. This was not fixed. Excavated texts from centuries following this show us that it was a corpus of roughly similar texts, a sort of almost library of texts that were supposed to be speeches and other important records from early times. But it was not fixed. It was almost like a branch of learning rather than just texts. Then a space, and then we have ritual and music. These were fields of study, but they were not texts at this time. Not yet written down. Now, what Confucius did, though, was that he made the aristocratic learning, which was already several centuries old, universal. For him, birth was no longer the measure of status. So in his eyes, human beings should be ranked according to their moral worth, and all human beings could perfect themselves with learning and morality. And one of the statements in the Analects is that he would teach anyone, regardless of social background. 有教无类 is the Chinese word expression for that. A key term is 君子. a princely person, a person of high Confucian attainment, achieved through self-cultivation. No longer did it mean a lordling, it meant anyone who achieved that status. And the very important virtue of ren, or humaneness, kindness, originally an aristocratic characteristic, was now available to anyone that could cultivate this quality. And according to the Analects, the way to achieve ren is by practicing li, or the ritual. So it was a way of improving the self, li, to become ren. It was also a system of social order superior to law because it caused people to regulate themselves. So laws and punishments only needed to be used when li, or the ritual rules, the ritual order, failed. So the ritual canons, the actual ritual texts, sorry, this is a bit more teachings of Confucius. Li was not just the motions, but the emotional and moral commitment behind them. You had to have that, or else they were worthless. Just the motions were not useful. The ancient ritual texts appeared sometime after the death of Confucius, but we know that by the time of Mencius, who lived in the 4th century BC, he quotes from a text called the Li. We later called the Li Jing, or the canon or classic of ritual, which we now know is probably more of it is preserved in the text we're talking about today, the Ili, or the Book of Etiquette and Rites, than in any other book. Although there's another one, the Li Ji, Records of Ritual, which also has things which seem to have been a part of that earlier ritual compendium, put together by the disciples of Confucius. The problem, though, is how do we convert the brief descriptions in the ancient ritual texts into instructions for actual ritual, which can be followed? So those texts were written at a time when people had a common understanding of how to do ritual and saw it in action all around them. So what Johnson and I have been calling the vocabulary, and I also say the grammar of ritual, the actual motions, what they looked like. People who had never seen them reading the text didn't know what to do. So there we have ritual studies. This is a branch of learning in traditional China. Schools in China now follow a sort of Western-oriented curriculum, maths and so on, but in ancient times there were forms of study according to the Chinese way of classifying learning. One of them was ritual studies, and the purpose of ritual masters, ritual scholars, was to reconstruct rituals so that they could actually be performed, especially in the imperial court. Oh, there's the vocabulary and grammar. So, I now hand over to Johnson because the modern counterparts of these scholars are hard at work today. And the question today is, what did the archery ritual of ancient China actually look like? How did they do it? So, over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Robert. Now I have the easy bit because I can show films and I don't need to be so scholarly about it. But what I'm going to show later on are actually a reconstruction of some of the important rituals recorded in that book we just spoke about, Book of Etiquette and Ceremonial, or Book of Etiquette and Rites. That is actually the earliest of the canons, and the book is pretty much unreadable. It's been famous for being a difficult book because it refers to movement, it refers to objects. In fact, it was a manual of performance. It was written like a film script, except that you don't know what these things they were talking about looked like. And so for centuries, even though it was the most important ritual book, it was partly understood, partly interpreted because there was a lineage of people practicing it. but the exact objects, a lot of it were only clarified in the last century through archaeological finds. But back to the original issue, why make such a big fuss about etiquette and rites? And there's no better illustration of the critical importance of etiquette in China than the legendary audience of Earl Macartney and with China's Emperor Qianlong in 1792. The purpose of the British Embassy was to request trade concession from China, and these were denied by the Emperor, mainly for reasons of incompatible worldviews. It was actually explained in a letter by the Emperor replying to King George III. But it has been commonly construed that the failure was due to a point of etiquette when Earl Macartney famously refused to kowtow to greet the Emperor and bowed instead. But what is the kowtow etiquette? Why do Chinese traditional etiquette and rites, well, what do they actually look like? Of course, there's no greater authority than the sage Confucius, 5th century BC. This book that Robert just explained to us was compiled by disciples of Confucius, probably between 4th and 5th century BC, and trying to set down in unambiguous terms the original rites. That was actually first introduced not by Confucius, but 5 centuries before Confucius, so 10th century BC, and the founder of the Zhou dynasty, which was still the dynasty when Confucius was around. So let us look at some pictures. Oops. There's another button over there. Not moving yet. This is just a sample of a whole lot of movements. It's obvious, the lower you go, the more respectful you are. And holding the hand, there are also different forms, whether the hands are going up or going down, which hand in front of the other. They're all codified. Now, one thing that needs to be made clear here, which is why there was this altercation between the courtiers of Emperor Qianlong. After the 10th century, Chinese people moved chairs into the house. Before that, people sat on the floor. So kowtow or kneeling was in fact not necessarily a particularly demeaning or respectful move. You all sit on the ground. When you kneel, actually you go up on your knees rather than go down, and then you bow. So in the modern days, when you actually stand on the feet on the ground and you go down your knees, this supplication looked much more serious than it did in the old days. And amazingly enough, all these movements were very precisely described in the ritual books, which is why they were pretty much unreadable. And even if they were readable, very few people would like to read them because they were so boring. So this step is half a step wider than the first one you just saw. yet another half step, a wider step. So the description which Professor Chard pointed out to us from the Analect, in fact referred to all these subtle differences in the circumstance, the office, and the position of the person. Well, there are still scores of this, but I believe we'll now spare the rest. And amazingly, as David Chang explained earlier, amazingly enough, these rites from 3 millennia ago have not been socially obsolete very long. Of course, Confucian rites have been modified over time, like we updating our iPhone apps. But it was only in 1912, with the demise of the Chang dynasty and the establishment of China's National Republic, that imperial rites were abolished. And with that started a gradual deterioration of secular rites and rituals. But why we make Confucian rites today? Well, the first reason is the boring one, which we already demonstrated to you with this lecture, is that this is an important scholarly exercise. It is an attempt to contribute to the millennia-old philological tradition of Confucian classics. And for philologists, the Book of Etiquette and Ceremonials is legendary for being difficult. But now we have the hindsight of modern archeology, very rapid advances in textual scholarship since the 18th century. And furthermore, the book was written like a performance manual, like a film script. So with giving exact direction as to positioning movements and precise placement of ritual objects. So it lends itself to be reenacted on screen. There are some other visuals we could take a look at. So remaking the Confucian rites. Now, the most important...
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you speed things up? Because I really want the audience to have at least 15 or 20 minutes to ask you questions.
All right.
I've seen you've written a PhD dissertation. Can you just guillotine half of it, at least?
Right. I'll go down to the master's thesis now. Right. Okay. The most important reason for remaking Confucian rites is because it brings us back to the critical moments of Chinese civilization. And today, China sits at a historical juncture that obliges it to look not just at the global future, but also at its own historical past. So if we revisit major moments of civilizational change in Chinese history, the first and foremost must be the era when the moral cosmology that we popularly called the Confucian worldview was established. This happened 500 years before Confucius, when the Zhou dynasty usurped the Shang dynasty in the 11th century BC. And when the great Duke of Zhou established a social-political order based on the culture of Li Yue, which Professor Chard just explained, Li usually translated as rites and Yue as music. And Li Yue came to be the term that defines what China means by civilization, rites and music. Li, in fact, means more than just rites. Li encompasses idea of social and cosmological order, and its principles were in fact incorporated into the legal and political system of the state. So the political revolution of the Zhou dynasty in the 11th century BC marked the most important turning point of China's civilization. It was the era when China's moral cosmology was systematized. By the 5th century BC, Confucius found it necessary to provide a fresh interpretation to the political order and to instruct a new breed of men of learning. So this became the basis of what we call the Confucian classics. But Confucius was not successful in his day, and his teaching of Li Yue was only adopted 2 centuries later, in 2nd century BC, by China's first major empire, the Han dynasty. And then from the Han dynasty onward, the Confucian classics were upheld as a basis of moral and political order and formed the core subject of scholarship and examination of civil servants, which is why they were kept. And in other words, these classics represented the knowledge system, the episteme of Chinese civilization. The next critical moment for China after the 11th century BC and the 2nd century BC, Han dynasty became, with Chinese empire, came in 10th century AD after the Tang dynasty. Tang as in David Tang, when this overwhelming popularity of Buddhistic teaching started to seriously affect China's socio-political system. And this precipitated another moment of epistemic change and resulted in the Neo-Confucian reinterpretation of the classics. And of the Neo-Confucians, the teaching of a 12th century scholar, Zhu Xi, who was born in 1130 to 1200, were eventually adopted as the foundation of China's state order, and it remained so, and remained in effect until 1911. The modern era, needless to say, has brought unprecedented challenges for another epistemic change. But from a civilization perspective, there has not yet been a proper response to these challenges. Modern China has essentially adopted European culture and politics. But then, what is now the role of China's moral cosmology? Or indeed, is there a role for it at all? So if the lesson of history is of any help, one important step that should be taken by us contemporaries is to revisit the Duke of Zhou. So to recapitulate, China has had 3 major epistemic transformations in the last 3,000 years, starting with the founding of its moral cosmology in 11th century BC under Duke of Zhou, followed by the revival undertaken by Confucius, and then leading to the Han Empire in 2nd century BC, then the 3rd transformation by New Confucians in the 12th century, and each time the epistemic change corresponded to crucial issues centering around the principles of Li. So this is a critical issue for China because it represented the whole knowledge structure of the civilization and not just rites and ritual. But in the modern era, instead of reviving and reinterpreting Li, it came under attack by modernizers, starting with the famous May 4th New Culture movement in 1919. And we're now coming up on the 100th anniversary very soon. Later, under Mao's rule, the concept of Li was even criminalized as being the principal culprit for China's so-called backwardness. This all seems very peculiar, given historical precedents. The question arises as to why do modernizers resent and perhaps even fear the idea of Li if it were only a set of rites and rituals? Li was in fact not just a philosophical concept. It is a belief system schematized within Chinese legal code and social structure. Historically, among the 6 ministries of the Chinese state, the ministry of Li was one of the most important. It oversaw state rituals, education, civil service examination, which decided who become officials, and foreign affairs. Therefore, Li was grounded institutionally as well as in everyday life. So the closest word that is equivalent in English is the word ideology. And like all ideological systems, Li is a politics of aesthetics. It permeates the way a Chinese person intuits the world, the way his world is being, the way he structures his sensibilities, and the way it situates him within a civilization. So the epistemic change for the modern era has fundamentally been a contestation of ideologies, which explains the relentless attacks on Li, which is a traditional ideology struggling to keep abreast of change. This contestation was clearly demonstrated in a disagreement over etiquette during Earl Macartney's audience with Emperor Qianlong in 1792. So today, it is as a politics of aesthetics that we may best reappropriate this heritage. Li should be approached as the principal foundation of Chinese aesthetics, through which it is possible to regain the original intuition that gave its moral cosmology. The particular ritual canon being screened here tonight actually shows how Li performed the world, in the sense that a regime of the body trains and demonstrates ways of socializing and gaining access to a cosmology. So in conclusion, now the end of the thesis, Confucian rites might therefore be construed as an ideological order grounded in a regime of the body and social behavior. And with China's traumatic civilizational shifts in the last century, a revisit of its cultural roots should help us to throw new, fresh perspectives on how to go forward. So thank you very much. I think it's... I'm sorry I had to sort of rush to without showing any images, because there's only way to keep people from yawning is to show the films with moving action. So
Dave Carr, can you just do a summary of that? I have no more than you ever will hope. Yeah. Question.
Rupert.
Oh, 1 minute, but just wait for the phone. On your left.
On my left. Okay. Sorry, I've got yeah, excuse me. So Johnson, you have written, summarizing the point you've just made, that when we have the history of Confucianism and the communists come along after the 1990 movement, they erase Confucianism. And then now, two questions I have. One is, with the, in a sense, communism changing its form and having a blank slate, your concern is that what's being written on the sort of semi-blank slate is Western materialism, and that's a bad thing, and that it's better to actually look back and get the best things out of Confucianism, reinstate them, particularly on aesthetics, which is what you've just said. My question is, to what extent, in a sense, despite the communists, has Confucianism continued through to today, in a sense handed down by people, father to son, mother to daughter, so that it already exists to be reignited, or to what extent it's gone and you're having with others to reinstate it?
Yes. Thank you. This is a very valid question, because all ideologies have their own regime of the body and its own aesthetics. Communism, for example, in China, after anybody says anything, everybody starts to clap, and it is the new set of rituals, and there are a complete set of different ways of dealing with society, social behavior. It's also in place because it is also a belief system. What is important with historical memory is that it is something that is still very much in the blood. It is still something that is being practiced. So by bringing forth the memory, and at least by revisiting original forms, it makes it possible for us to, well, now that we have a distance with Confucian etiquette and ritual and the worldview, now by going back to the original forms, the original material, it in fact adds a resource which in the old days we took for granted. So that is, I think, the important part.
But isn't the fundamental difference that in Confucianism you're dealing with what he wants largely to be an egalitarian society, so that they can bring the ordinary person up as a princely gentleman, whereas communism, exactly the opposite, of trying to suppress everybody down and make everybody more common. So there's a real cache of culture about the way in which modern China sets itself forward. Indeed, the entire 20th century was based on Marxism, capitalism, and land reform, all of which, and republicanism, of course, all of which were completely Western ideas. This idea that Henry Kissinger's and the likes thinks that, you know, China has got this incredible history is just non-existent in the 20th century.
Well, when Mao was a young man, he was very keen on Confucius. And there's one thing about Confucius and Confucian cosmology that is still a legacy that is carried on to today, is this concern with equality and fairness. And that is what Chinese intellectuals at the beginning of last century saw in socialism, communism. But let's look at some images. Oh, by the way, we're actually speaking here today. There was one historical proceedings as well. The Duke of Chang here, when he founded the China Exchange, that was the first presentation of the film that we made of etiquette, which was the coming of age ceremony, which was the first day of the Lunar New Year 2 years ago. So here's the image. And about remaking the rituals. Oh, sorry. Should we actually quickly go over some of the pictures so that...
Some questions first.
I have a quick question, neither intellectual or intelligent enough, I imagine. So just, Confucianism died in 1912 after a series of cultural and military shocks, ending in the First Sino-Japanese War. So, and it basically been seen to be no longer useful. To what extent is it, or could it be construed as useful in modern China? To what extent could the Communist Party see it as a useful addition, or is it in so far removed from communist ideals because could it not ever be deemed to be useful?
I think there are a lot of very strong subterranean currents in Chinese culture and Chinese civilization that make modern China possible as it is today. For example, all these revolutions that happened in China starting from the 19th century, and also this radical way of rebelling against your own past and to throw things out to go forward. This is very radical. I mean, this is actually much more radical politics than any Western country has ever done. And it's probably the most radical thing that has happened in human history in the last 2 centuries was how Chinese civilization totally turned against itself. But the idea of revolution, which in Chinese is the word "geming," was actually a very old concept. When the Duke of Zhou usurped the dynasty of Chang in 11th century BC, that was considered one of the first important geming. Now, in China today, the word revolution, American Revolution, French Revolution, this type of revolution, this word is translated into Chinese with the same word, geming, which is the word that was used for the usurpation of the Shang dynasty by the Zhou dynasty. And with the Zhou dynasty, it was the first time that it was heralded as an important event in geming, and it legitimized the rule of the Zhou dynasty. So geming is supposed to legitimize a regime. And the reason the Zhou legitimized itself was because of the introduction of a systematized li. And that is really the importance of li in the history of revolution, in China's first major revolution. So my question to Mao would be, we now have a successful revolution. Only if you can tell us what is the new li of China. So maybe it is a set of li that has not been properly schematized as yet. So maybe we're still waiting for the Duke of Zhou to appear. We did have Zhou Enlai, and in fact, during the Cultural Revolution, when there were a lot of these political struggles, he was always being made fun of as the Duke of Zhou.
Professor, have you got anything to add?
Only that the Zhou dynasties established itself on the claim that they were moral and that the Shang before were not. So this was something new in Chinese civilization. So it wasn't just the Li, it was also another concept, de, which we translate as virtue, or virtuous power in English. So that was another, quite a big shift in the way all subsequent dynasties presented themselves in the same way as we now. And the Ming in Ge-Ming is, we translate as the mandate of heaven, that heaven has chosen you because of your virtue to be the next ruler.
But when you talked about the end of Confucianism in 1911, you're talking about the physical imperial examination.
The physical imperial examination actually ended even before that, but it was really ending of the state system.
I mean, that's why we're always accused of regurgitation, because the whole examination system in Confucian is one of regurgitation. You don't write original essays. Today, you would fail miserably at an entrance at Oxford or Cambridge. And that is a principle that was embedded in the intellectual existence of China, and that was the test through which you managed to show yourself to be a learned scholar, princely gentleman.
I shall bring things back a bit, talking about rights in this country, as we just saw the current Duchess of Cornwall there just a moment ago. That my question to all three of you is, will she become the queen once her husband becomes king? Because we know some people are not too happy that she will one day become queen, because the former wife of her husband is still probably more popular than she will ever be.
Where is the Ministry of Lee in London?
I mean, I don't think Andrew Parker Bowles is that popular, but I think the question is that anything can happen. I mean, if you just thought back 10 or 20, 15 years ago, she was totally persona non grata, and today she's very popular. The Queen recognizes her, and you get closer and closer. And given the way in which the world's politics and landscape can change dramatically, she might even become, I don't know, imperial empress over Prince of Wales. Yes.
Hi, I'm more interested in the perception of what you consider as Li, because as Professor Robert Chard, he translates it as a ritual, which is would interpret more as something sacrificial, but as Mr. Johnson Chang considered it, it's more intuitional due to the westernization of Mao, and yeah, but to us, like after the Cultural Revolution of Mao, the Intuit, sorry, the intuition is now more considered as something more common, like some movements that you would do as maybe a laborer would do in everyday life. But so the question is, how do you think we would use the Li in a contemporary way?
Well, to use the spirit of Li, like Professor Shah just explained to us, and the philosophical principles is one level. But for me, as a person coming from the art field, my interest is really very much in the form and the structure of Li. How is the moral being performed? How is the world, the social world that makes it possible for a person to find his identity, to navigate himself across the society? What is the tool, the technique? And in fact, Li is that training, is that technique. So every era would have its own Li. But the Li, which has a historical lineage, adds more weight to, and adds more substance because it brings back forgotten memories. And in a way, remaking an old ritual, which is 3,000 years old, is also reconstructing a myth. And it is also reconstructing something to attach one's intuitions of the world to. So this is really the purpose of doing this.
Is that a video? I mean, you can play that whilst people are asking
Yes.
questions.
Okay, I'm just showing. So
Yeah,
you're just.
don't worry about it. People can watch it. But we want more questions. Come on, where?
Johnson, can I ask you, may I ask you, is Li exportable beyond to other races and other cultures and other civilizations, or is it a uniquely Chinese concept which can't be reproduced in other civilizations, particularly today?
Well, in the Chinese frame of things, I was about to mention that also in answer to the previous, is that it's universal. It is not. The Chinese really did not have much of an ethnic conception of themselves until very, very recently, the late 19th century. It was constructed as a way of, one reason European countries are strong is they have strong national ethnic identities. In ancient China, anyone could become universally, could join the universal order of Li. And people up through the Ming would refer to countries that know Li, ritual, which really meant they were civilized, and ones that did not yet know Li, which means they're not civilized now, but they will be eventually.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask about Confucius' notion of mindfulness or simply paying attention, because I'm reminded of the composer John Cage, who said, if something is boring after 2 minutes, try it for 4. If it's still boring, try it for 6 and 8 and so on. And then eventually you can discover that it's actually very interesting. And I'm thinking about Confucianism when he says, I will not open the door for a mind that is not already striving to understand, nor will I provide words to a tongue that is not already struggling to speak. And I think these kind of ideas are really important today, that we still need to spend time paying attention and listening. And this is what I find valuable to coming today. And I hope that this is something we can take away or learn from. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, I would agree, especially with the business of all the minutiae of ritual, Chinese ritual, being rather difficult to accept, especially to a Western mind. You do have to think about it and what it means and why it's there and what it means to the people who engage in it. And when you do that, and it does take time, so the translators of the 2 ritual texts, James Legge, who translated the Records of Ritual, came under a lot of, not criticism as much as just simply bewilderment. You know, this is your last greatest translation from the Chinese classics, as he called them. Why did you translate that book full of, you know, bejeweled hats and all the rest of it? They just didn't get it. What's the point?
I don't think Confucius need to consult John Cage. Anyway, I can tell you the answer is 4 minutes 33, because that's the piece he wrote. Somebody come onto the piano for 4 minutes 33 seconds, and then he goes off without doing anything.
I just want to cut in to say, you're watching clips from the reconstruction of the rite of archery, and this may be called the earliest diplomatic sport. They were performed by ministers meeting each other, by one province leader meeting another province leader, Shang Shili.
What was your point about not hitting the target, but piercing it?
It's from Confucius.
I mean, what's the difference?
The point is actually not how strong you are, but whether you are on target or not. So it is not about the powerfulness of the weapon. It is about, because the shooting an arrow is about centering the heart.
You mean positioning rather than the depth to which the arrow goes in?
Because every person has different strength. So even if you're not a warrior, but if you are centered enough, you'll be able to hit the target. But whether you can pierce it deep enough, it depends on the strength of the person.
Well, and the idea too that archery is moral cultivation, as it's defeating the opponent isn't the point. The point is yourself. How do you cultivate yourself and improve yourself morally by the ritual of archery, which is simply part of the ritual training.
The rite of archery will have 3 rounds, and the third round, it has to be, the arrow has to be released on the moment. In fact, the arrow has to be released so that it will hit the target in time when the drummer beats the drum. So that's when music and this sport come together.
A question about the historical reconstruction, the parallel with the cultivation of the body in European courts and the practice of music in the European church or secular concerts. These have been actually developed and preserved in very sophisticated forms of notation, both for dance movements. Dance was incredibly important at European courts in the 16th to the 19th century, and dance movements were actually visually represented in special manuals. Music has been recorded in special notation, which is one of the reasons that historical reconstructions of European music are possible. Do any forms of precise notation of pitch or duration or rhythm or quality of sound exist for Chinese classical music? And are the rituals also represented in any form of written, not just description in words, but actual visual representations of the way the feet or the arm moves in the way that, say, European court dances were represented?
The book of music.
Yeah, I mean, the odes are music, but in short, especially from such an early time, I mean, some of the odes or the songs are as much as 3,000 years old, and we don't have anything from that period. Nor, I think musical notation has been found, I've forgotten from when, that cannot be deciphered. We don't know how to read it.
No, there was a very precise description of musical notations. They all come in a character form. But what was extraordinarily different between the Chinese musical notations and English or the British or the Western is that we didn't have composers as such, and nobody actually composed. The acolytes merely defer to the masters, and occasionally the masters would change just 1 or 2 strokes. They all look like characters, and they're extensively codified. And so if you go back to the ancient scores for the sitar or the hutong or whatever it is, they're very precise. But they developed and evolved in a very, very slow pace compared to the flourishing of the music, you know, in Western eras from the 16th to the 20th century. And so the music itself became stagnant. That's why when you hear Chinese music, they all sound a bit the same. That's because no composers came along and started innovating like Stravinsky or Debussy, and that's the problem. So I think that the music actually lagged behind the development of the ritual itself, and that's why there was not, in Chinese history, in my mind, this combination. Let's have a last question.
Hello. I was wondering, to what extent can Confucianism be linked to filial piety, a concept at the heart of many Chinese households? I believe this concept of social etiquette, is it possible to link the two?
Yes, it was one of the most fundamental virtues taught by Confucius and his followers.
Because
and
the
successors.
family was the sacred unit, as far as Confucius is concerned, wasn't it?
Yes, and the fact too that if the family can be ordered, then the whole country can be ordered. That was a very persistent idea.
That's why the one-child system, one-child policy, completely collapsed. This core teaching in Confucius. And now today, this generation, you have no brothers, no sisters, no uncles, aunts, nephews, nieces. I mean, you know, I can see Confucius spinning in his grave like a super satellite. Well, anyway, look, all right, one last question.
Hi, a really interesting presentation, and it really stirs the imagination. Thank you.
Very good graphics.
Yeah, also very good graphics. 100,000 thoughts a day. That's something like what we're getting, and piling in from our mobiles, PCs, internet, TV, films. We're being overwhelmed by all of this rubbish. So, in terms of Li, which is has it a relation to Qi, and therefore meditation, and how much does it form moving meditation?
Well, it was a physical discipline, and we have people throughout history saying that such and such a student, after studying only a year, is better at the movements than someone, advanced Confucian scholars who've been doing it for a decade or 2 decades. So it is very much, people have compared it to a dance, you know, masters of the dance, these masters of ritual or masters of the dance. I've not ever come across sort of like a Taiji sort of mentions of ritual or of qi in that context, but I'm sure they would exist.
What's the relationship between qi and li?
There are two very different words and very different concepts. But certainly, qi, when you talk about energy, li li as a discipline of the body, if you compare it to, say, exercises like yoga or martial arts, a proper yoga teacher or a martial arts teacher will not talk to you about qi. He will tell you how to stand properly, how to stretch your body into a certain position and hold it there and wait for the body to relax and wait for it to speak to you, and then you move. So it is also finding the centering, but you're doing it not because you go to this abstract concept or the energy. You actually approach it through this very physical, material presence of the body. And in that sense, that was really the great success of the system of Li, because it was about an overt form which can be trained. And through that training, one learns to intuit certain ideas, certain ways of the world. And certainly, it was a system which not only teaches you how to deal with yourself, it also teaches you how to deal with your superiors. It is also in a way a defense system. If a man of Li learns also to throw off somebody who tries to bully him by being the master of proper behavior.
Well, I think it's much more important for you to remember qi and li, because in Scrabble, qi is accepted, 11 points. Li is not accepted, 3 points. Anyway, look, listen, I'm afraid that we have overrun by at least 15 minutes, and it's been fascinating. And will you please join me in thanking Professor Chard and Johnson Chang. Sign that.